There are places in this world that don't belong, places that shouldn't exist, yet somehow they do. The diner doesn't have a name, no neon signs buzzing against the dark, no billboards on the highway advertising its existence. But if you drive long enough, down the empty stretch of road cutting through the Ohio wilderness, you'll see it. A squat, rusted building with flickering lights, its windows fogged from the inside like it's breathing. And if you stop, if you make the mistake of stepping inside, you may never leave the same. I wish someone had warned me before I took the job. The first time I saw the diner, I was lost. My phone had no signal, my gas light was flashing, and the road behind me was nothing but endless black. Then, out of nowhere, it appeared, a lone diner humming in the middle of nothing. It didn't feel right. Something about it made my stomach twist, but desperation overpowered my instincts. Inside, the air was thick and stale, carrying a scent I couldn't place, like burned sugar and something sickly sweet. The floor was sticky beneath my shoes. The overhead lights flickered in slow, deliberate pulses, like they were blinking at me. And the people, they weren't eating. They weren't drinking coffee. They just sat, staring straight ahead, unblinking, their faces stretched too tight over their bones. Every now and then, one of them would shift, a jerk of the neck, a twitch of the fingers, but never naturally. It was like watching something pretend to be human, trying to remember how a body should move. I should have turned around, but before I could step back outside, a voice called to me. "You looking for work?" I hadn't planned on getting a job. I was just passing through. But when I turned and saw the man standing behind the counter, thin, hollow-eyed, with deep creases in his face like something had been pulling at his skin for years, I couldn't speak. "You need money, don't you?" I nodded. "Then you start tonight." He slid a crumpled piece of paper across the counter. "Follow these rules. Do not break them, no matter what." The 5 strange rules. Rule 1. If a man in a gray suit enters, seat him at booth number 6. Do not let him sit anywhere else. If booth number 6 is occupied, you must ask the person sitting there to leave, no matter what. Rule 2. Between 2:13 a.m. and 2:17 a.m., do not look outside. No matter what you hear, no matter how loud they knock, do not open the door. Rule 3. If you see a woman in a red dress sitting at the counter, do not acknowledge her. Do not take her order. If she speaks to you, go into the back room and stay there until she leaves. Rule 4. Never, under any circumstances, serve the coffee after midnight. If someone asks for it, tell them we're out. If they insist, you must leave the diner immediately. Rule 5. If you ever hear someone whisper your name, but no one is around, go to the kitchen, turn off all the lights, and count to 30. Do not speak. Do not move. Do not breathe too loud. If you hear footsteps while you're counting, pray they don't stop. I wanted to laugh. I wanted to tell him this was a joke, right? But something in his face told me it wasn't. "You follow these rules," he said, "and you might make it through the night." "Might?" I echoed, my voice barely above a whisper. The man didn't answer. He just nodded toward the back, where a clock on the wall ticked 2:12 a.m., 1 minute before rule number 2. Then, outside, something knocked. Hard. The sound wasn't normal. It wasn't a person knocking on a door. It was slow, deliberate, like something pressing against the glass, testing it. I could hear it breathing. The lights above me dimmed, and I felt something watching. Gus grabbed my arm. "Don't look." I clenched my eyes shut. The knocking got louder. Something dragged across the windows, nails scraping against the glass. Then the whispering started. A voice just outside, soft, sweet, like it knew me. "Let us in." I dug my nails into my palms. The air inside the diner had changed. It felt heavier, thicker, like the walls were closing in. My pulse hammered against my ribs. The whispering didn't stop. It repeated my name over and over, pleading. Then came the second voice. This one wasn't human. It slithered through the cracks in the door, slipping under the threshold, curling into my ears. "Open the door." The lights flickered again. I gritted my teeth, squeezing my eyes tighter, but I could feel it pressing against the glass. Then, silence. I counted in my head. 1, 2, 3. I couldn't hear Gus breathing. 4, 5. Something shifted behind the counter. 6, 7. Something clicked. 8, 9. A whisper behind me. "Turn around." I clenched my jaw. 10, 11. Something brushed my shoulder. 12, 13. The air turned cold. 14, 15. Then, just like that, it was gone. At 2:18 a.m., Gus exhaled, long and shuddering. You see why we don't look? I opened my eyes. The diner was exactly the same. The lights still flickered, the customers still sat in eerie silence, and the windows were clean. But something had changed. A man in a gray suit sat at booth number 6, and he was smiling at me. It wasn't a polite smile, nor a friendly one. It was the kind of smile stretched too wide, the kind that didn't belong on a human face. His lips were pale, cracked at the corners, revealing teeth that looked too perfect, like they had never been used, never bitten into anything real. He placed his hands on the table, long fingers tapping against the surface in a slow, deliberate rhythm. I forced myself to move, my legs heavy, stiff. Gus was already behind the counter, pretending to clean, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his knuckles went white around the rag. This was a test, my first real test. I swallowed hard and walked toward the man. He tilted his head slightly, watching me. His eyes were wrong. Something about them felt hollow, like the color had been painted on. The closer I got, the stronger the urge to stop moving became. My body screamed at me, begged me to turn around, to run, to throw myself out the front door and never look back. But I didn't. "Can I get you anything?" I asked, barely recognizing my own voice. The man blinked slowly. "Coffee." My stomach twisted. "Rule number 4. We don't serve coffee after midnight," I said. His fingers stopped tapping. The air around me seemed to tighten, like invisible hands wrapping around my throat. The diner felt smaller, suffocating, the overhead lights buzzing so loudly it made my skull ache. "Are you sure?" His voice was smooth, too smooth, like it had been practiced. "Yes," I whispered. For a long moment, he didn't move. The hum of the diner's lights became unbearable, a high-pitched whine boring into my skull. Then, finally, he leaned back, that awful smile widening. "Good." I didn't know what that meant. I didn't want to know. I turned away quickly, my hands shaking as I made my way back to the counter. Gus didn't say anything, just gave me a slow nod before disappearing into the kitchen. I didn't blame him. The man in the gray suit stayed at booth number 6, unmoving, watching, always watching. Minutes passed, maybe hours. The clock above the counter ticked forward, but I stopped keeping track. The diner's customers remained frozen in their seats, just as they had when I first arrived, staring straight ahead, unblinking, their chests rising and falling in unnatural, mechanical patterns. I tried not to look at them for too long. It made my skin crawl. The bell above the door jingled. I turned, and my stomach dropped. She walked in like she belonged there. Slow, graceful, her heels clicking against the tile, a deep crimson dress hugging her frame. Rule number 3. I felt my blood turn to ice. She slid onto a stool at the counter, her nails tapping against the surface. Her skin was too pale, too smooth, like porcelain. Her eyes never blinked. She stared directly at me, smiling slightly, waiting. I clenched my fists. Do not acknowledge her. Do not take her order. If she speaks, go to the back room and stay there until she leaves. I focused on breathing. She drummed her fingers against the counter, a slow, deliberate rhythm. The same rhythm the man in the gray suit had used. I turned away, forcing myself to focus on a stain on the floor, anywhere but her. My heartbeat pounded in my ears, drowning out everything else. "Excuse me," she said. Her voice sent a cold shudder down my spine. It was smooth, melodic, almost too perfect. I squeezed my eyes shut. Don't respond. Don't acknowledge her. The lights flickered. The air grew heavy. Something moved in my peripheral vision. I did not look. She spoke again, softer this time. "I know you can hear me." My chest tightened. I felt something just behind me, an impossible presence leaning in. My skin prickled. "Get to the back room." I forced my legs to move, shuffling backward, trying not to run. Running would make it worse. I don't know how I knew that, but I did. Her nails scraped against the counter as I stepped away. I reached the kitchen door and shoved it open, stumbling inside. Gus was already there, standing completely still. His face was pale, his breathing shallow. "She's here," I whispered. "I know." He grabbed my arm and pulled me further in, past the metal shelves, past the sink, into the tiny storage closet in the back. He flicked the light off and pressed his finger to his lips. In the silence, we listened. The diner was still. Then, footsteps. She was moving now, slowly, deliberately. I could hear her fingers dragging along the counter, her nails scraping against the surface. She was looking for me. The air inside the closet was suffocating. I felt the walls closing in, my own heartbeat too loud. Gus remained perfectly still, barely breathing. The footsteps grew closer. Then they stopped. Right outside the door, the handle twitched. I bit the inside of my cheek so hard I tasted blood. A pause. Then she knocked, soft, rhythmic, the same pattern. I clenched my teeth. Gus squeezed his eyes shut. The knock came again, insistent. Then, finally, silence. We stayed in that closet for what felt like hours. Neither of us moved, neither of us spoke. The diner outside remained still, frozen in time. Finally, Gus exhaled, his breath shaky. She's gone. I didn't ask how he knew. I didn't want to know. When we finally stepped out, the diner was exactly the same as before. The customers still sat in eerie silence, staring ahead. The lights still flickered. The walls still felt wrong. But the stool at the counter where she had been sitting, it was gone. Not empty. Gone, like it had never been there in the first place. And at booth number 6, the man in the gray suit was still watching, still smiling. I forced myself to move, my feet dragging against the checkered floor as I made my way back to the counter. Every step felt wrong, like I was wading through something thick, something invisible, something that pressed against my skin like wet cloth. The diner hadn't changed, but I could feel that something was different. The air was heavier, thick with something I couldn't name. My ears were ringing. Gus hadn't spoken since we left the storage room. He just stood behind the counter, staring at the register, his jaw locked so tight I thought his teeth might break. I swallowed hard. What the hell was that? He didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse. You don't want to know. That was the second time he'd said that tonight. And he was right. I didn't. The clock above the counter ticked forward, each second scraping against my nerves. 1:58 a.m. My stomach clenched. I didn't know how long the man in the gray suit would stay. I didn't know if the woman in the red dress would come back. I didn't even know if I was allowed to leave. I just knew one thing. 2:13 a.m. was coming. I looked toward the front door, toward the long stretch of glass that revealed the endless, empty highway beyond. The thought of what might come when the clock struck 2:13 made my hands tremble. Gus finally looked up, meeting my eyes for the first time since we'd stepped out of the storage room. We should go to the back, he said. I nodded. Neither of us ran. Running made things worse. The kitchen door swung shut behind us, just as the clock hit 2:12 a.m. And then the knocking started. It wasn't on the door. It was on the glass of the front window of the diner. My breath caught in my throat. Someone was outside. I squeezed my eyes shut. Do not look. Do not look. The knocking grew louder. Then came the voices. At first, they were distant, faint murmurs that slithered through the cracks in the walls. Then they became clearer. They were calling my name. The sound of it, my own name spoken in a voice that was not mine, sent a sickening jolt through my body. It was wrong. It was all wrong. The lights in the kitchen flickered. The air turned bitterly cold. The knocking became pounding, insistent, desperate. Something wanted in. Gus grabbed my wrist and squeezed, his grip ice cold. Don't listen, he whispered. But the voices were getting louder. Some of them sounded like people I knew. My mother, my brother, an old friend I hadn't spoken to in years. Others were strangers. Some of them were laughing. Some were sobbing. One of them sounded just like me. I clenched my fist so hard my nails dug into my palms. 2:15 a.m. 2 more minutes. A low, dragging scrape echoed from outside, something heavy being pulled across the pavement. My stomach lurched. Gus's grip tightened. Don't move, he breathed. The air in the room changed. I could feel something shifting, something pulling at the space between the walls. Then the door handle rattled. Not the front door, the kitchen door. I nearly gasped, but Gus clamped a hand over my mouth before I could make a sound. Something was inside. The rattling stopped. A long, unbearable silence stretched between us. Then, footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Right on the other side of the door. A single whisper curled through the room, breathy and low, pressing into my ears like a coiled hand. Let me in. I felt something cold crawl up my spine. The footsteps stopped. 2:17 a.m. Then nothing. The knocking stopped. The voices stopped. The diner was silent again. Gus let out a shaky breath and dropped his hand from my mouth. Is it over? I asked, barely above a whisper. For now, he muttered, but it always comes back. I exhaled slowly, my hands trembling. We waited a few more minutes before stepping back into the main area of the diner. Everything looked the same unnatural stillness, the same empty seats, the same man in the gray suit still watching from booth 6. The highway outside stretched into the endless dark, empty, and silent. I didn't realize how tense I was until Gus touched my arm. I nearly jumped. You need to be careful, he said, his voice grave. You made it through the first night, but the diner, it's testing you. I swallowed hard. Testing me for what? Gus didn't answer. Instead, he nodded toward the clock. 3 a.m. I let out a shaky breath. The worst was over, or so I thought. I turned toward the counter, ready to sit down for just a second. My legs felt like stone, my body like it had been drained of every ounce of warmth. And that's when I noticed it. The coffee pot. It was full. My stomach twisted. Gus went rigid beside me. We didn't make that, I whispered. No, he murmured. We didn't. The man in the gray suit lifted his cup, staring at me over the rim. Still smiling. I took a step back. The coffee in his cup wasn't black. It was thick, deep red, and it was still steaming. The steam curled up from the deep red liquid, twisting in the dim light like something alive. I couldn't move. The man in the gray suit just watched me, his lips curled into that same thin, unnatural smile. His fingers, long and pale, wrapped delicately around the handle of the cup. He didn't drink, he just held it, letting the steam rise between us. Gus grabbed my arm. His fingers dug into my skin. Don't say anything, he murmured, barely moving his lips. Don't acknowledge it. I couldn't tear my eyes away. It wasn't coffee in his cup. It wasn't even liquid, not really. The way it moved, slow, thick, pulsing, it reminded me of something else. Something I didn't want to think about. A sharp clink broke the silence. The man had set the cup down. His smile widened. Would you like some? His voice was wrong. It was smooth, almost pleasant, but there was something behind it, something that sent an icy nail straight through my skull. It was like he was speaking through his own voice, like something else was inside him, pushing the words out. Gus's grip tightened. We're out of coffee, he said, his voice steady, but there was an edge to it, a warning. The man in the gray suit didn't blink. Are you sure? Gus didn't answer. The man exhaled a slow, unnervingly amused breath, then lifted his cup again. The steam swirled, twisting into shapes, not random shapes, faces. I took a step back. I didn't know them, but they knew me. Their eyes, black, hollow pits fixed on me as their mouths twisted into silent screams. The diner felt colder. The air around me grew thick, suffocating. My ears buzzed, a distant, droning hum filling my skull, vibrating through my bones. The faces in the steam moved. They weren't just forming, they were changing. Their features stretched, distorted. Then, one of them mouthed my name. A sharp pain shot through my temples. Get away. Get away. I turned too fast, nearly knocking over the coffee pot on the counter. The scent hit me then. Something foul, something metallic, something that wasn't coffee. I gagged, slamming my hand over my mouth. Gus grabbed my arm again, harder this time, his nails pressing into my skin. Go to the back. Now. I didn't argue. I stumbled toward the kitchen, my breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. My stomach twisted, a sickening gut-deep nausea crawling up my throat. Do not serve the coffee after midnight. We hadn't made that coffee. So, who did? The moment I stepped into the back room, I collapsed against the wall. The buzzing in my head hadn't stopped. If anything, it was louder, like something was pressing against the inside of my skull, pushing, clawing, trying to get in. The kitchen door swung shut. Gus followed. His face was pale, his hands shaking. He doesn't leave, he muttered. I swallowed hard. What? Gus didn't answer. He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. Then, in a voice just barely above a whisper, he said, He's been sitting there since the diner opened. The words hit me like a punch to the chest. I opened my mouth, then closed it again. My head was spinning. That's not possible. Gus let out a hollow, humorless laugh. Tell that to him. The diner had been open for years. Decades, maybe. And the man in the gray suit had always been there? My stomach turned. I grabbed the counter, grounding myself. What is he? Gus shook his head. I don't know. I don't think anyone does. I closed my eyes. The faces in the steam, the voices outside, the knocking, the whisper that knew my name. This place was wrong. I had known that the second I walked through the doors. But now I knew it wasn't just wrong. It was hungry, and it had been waiting for me. A sudden noise sent a sharp jolt through my body. Not knocking, not whispers, footsteps. From the other side of the kitchen, Gus's breath hitched. We weren't alone. Slow, dragging steps echoed through the dimly lit back room. Closer, closer. I turned my head, just enough to see. The door to the storage room was open, and something was standing in the doorway. I couldn't see its face. I wasn't sure it even had one. It was tall, impossibly thin, its limbs too long, its fingers curled, twitching. Its body was a blur, like it wasn't fully there, like it was shifting between being something and nothing at all. Gus froze. I couldn't breathe. The thing stepped forward. The light flickered. A sound crawled through the room, something low, guttural, wrong. Then it moved. Fast. I didn't think. I grabbed Gus's arm and yanked. We bolted. The kitchen door slammed open as we stumbled into the diner. The air was thick, suffocating. The man in the gray suit was still there, still smiling. The coffee cup was gone. The steam still lingered. I didn't stop running. I reached the front door and grabbed the handle. Locked. My pulse spiked. I yanked harder. Nothing. Behind me, Gus whispered, "Oh, God." I turned. The lights in the diner were going out. One by one, the hanging bulbs flickered, then died, casting the room in shifting shadows. The thing from the storage room was inside now. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it. The buzzing in my head spiked, a deep, low-frequency hum that crawled through my bones. I heard something move behind the counter. Then, a whisper. Not from the man in the gray suit. Not from Gus. From directly behind me. My name, spoken in my own voice. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Then, just before the last light flickered out, I saw it. Standing right in front of me, smiling, and it looked exactly like me. Its smile was too wide, its teeth too white, too straight, like they'd been carved from something unnatural. And its eyes, my eyes, held nothing inside them. No light, no life. Just a hollow black emptiness stretching too far back, as if there was something else lurking inside, watching me through my own stolen face. I couldn't move. It stepped closer. The dim light above flickered, casting shifting shadows across its face, my face, as it tilted its head in a way that wasn't right. A slow, mechanical motion, like a puppet testing its strings. The air between us was thick, charged with something wrong, something hungry. Then it spoke. Not with my voice, with all of them. A layered, fractured sound that carried the echoes of every word I had ever spoken, every whisper, every breath, every scream. I have been waiting. Gus let out a sharp, panicked breath. I could hear his shoes scuffing against the floor as he stumbled backward, but I couldn't look away. The thing lifted its hand. My hand. Its fingers twitched, stretching, bending at the joints in a way that made my stomach twist. The bones didn't just move. They shifted, reshaping, cracking, realigning into something that barely resembled a human hand anymore. The buzzing in my skull grew louder. The lights overhead shattered, one by one, raining down glass that never seemed to hit the floor. It just disappeared. The diner had fallen into an unnatural darkness, broken only by the dim glow of the neon sign outside, bleeding red light through the windows. I didn't remember opening my mouth. But I must have, because my voice, the real one, the only one I was sure of, trembled from my lips. "What are you?" The thing smiled wider, too wide. And then it lunged. I threw myself back just as its fingers curled toward me, missing by inches. Gus grabbed my arm, yanking me away from the counter as we stumbled blindly into the darkness. The diner had changed, stretched, warped, like the walls had been pulled farther apart, like the space we were running through was no longer the same one we had started in. I could hear it behind us. Not footsteps. Something worse. A wet, dragging sound, as if something was crawling, skittering, pulling itself forward too fast. Gus yanked me into the back room, slamming the door behind us. His breath came in ragged, uneven gasps. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding against my skull. The kitchen was wrong. The walls curved inward. The tiles beneath my feet shifted, rippling like the diner was breathing. The air smelled like burnt sugar and something rotting underneath it. Gus grabbed my shoulders. The rule. His voice was strained, nearly hysterical. The rule, if you hear your name, you go to the kitchen, you turn off the lights, you count to 30. It had whispered my name. The room seemed to press in, the weight of something unseen coiling around us. I reached out, fumbling for the light switch with shaking hands. The second I flipped it, the darkness swallowed us whole. The sounds from the diner stopped. Silence. I couldn't even hear Gus breathing. I started counting. 1, 2, 3. Somewhere in the pitch black, something moved. 4, 5. A soft, deliberate tap against the tiled floor. 6, 7. Then another. Closer. 8, 9. My heartbeat slammed against my ribs. 10. A whisper. Not my name. Not words. Just a sound. A low exhale as if something was right in front of my face. Waiting. 11. 12. I clenched my teeth, forcing my body to stay completely still. 13. 14. The air was freezing now. 15. The footsteps started again. 16. They didn't walk. 17. They dragged. 18. 19. A breath at my ear. 20, a hand on my shoulder. 21, I wanted to scream. 22, the fingers pressed in. 23, a second hand, on my other shoulder. 24, the buzzing in my skull became unbearable. 25, 26, the hands tightened. 27, 28, I could feel its mouth opening just inches from my face. 29, a voice, not mine, not Gus's, not human. Time's up. 30, I slammed my fist against the light switch. White-hot light flooded the room, and Gus was gone. The hands, the whispers, the dragging footsteps, gone. I was alone. I turned, frantic, searching the warped, pulsing walls. Gus? My voice cracked. No answer. I swallowed the panic, forcing myself toward the door. I grabbed the handle, pushing it open, and the diner was empty. No booths, no counter, no man in the gray suit, just endless dark stretching out in front of me, a void that breathed, moving in slow, rippling waves. Then, a sound. Distant, faint, the ringing of a bell. The front door bell. Someone had entered the diner, or something. I turned slowly. There, sitting at the counter, was a woman. A woman in a red dress. She was facing forward, hands resting on the counter, her nails tapping an impossible rhythm against the surface. She was smiling, but she wasn't looking at me. Not yet. A slow, creeping dread settled into my bones. Rule 3. If you see a woman in a red dress sitting at the counter, do not acknowledge her. Do not take her order. If she speaks to you, go into the back room and stay there until she leaves. The air shifted, carrying something sickly sweet, something that smelled like fading perfume and old blood. I forced myself to move. One step back, then another. Her fingers stopped tapping. The silence pressed in. Then, in a voice so soft, so deadly, she spoke. "You're not supposed to be here." I bolted. The air behind me felt heavy, like it was pressing in, reaching out, waiting for me to slow down. I didn't dare turn around, didn't dare look at her. I knew what would happen if I did. My heart slammed against my ribs as I lunged into the back room and yanked the door shut behind me. My hands trembled as I locked it, breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The dim light overhead buzzed weakly, flickering, casting shadows that didn't seem to stay in one place. The kitchen still wasn't right. The walls curved inward, the air carried that rotten sweetness, and I could feel something just beyond my vision shifting, watching, waiting. I backed up until I hit the counter, squeezing my eyes shut, trying to slow my breathing. I needed to wait. That was the rule. I just had to stay here until she left. Then, a knock. Not on the door behind me, from the front of the diner. A slow, deliberate tap, tap, tap against the glass. My stomach lurched. No, 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 no. 2:13 a.m. It was happening again. A sharp whisper, half-formed, curled against my ear, though I was alone. "Let us in." I clenched my teeth, squeezing my hands into fists. Ignore it. The knocking came again, louder. Tap, tap, tap. Then a voice. Not a whisper this time. A man's voice. "Hey, I think the door's stuck," he called. "Can you open up?" I stayed frozen. "Come on, man," the voice continued, casual, friendly. "Wrong. It's freezing out here. Just let us in." I pressed myself harder against the counter, fighting the urge to scream. Then, another voice. A woman this time. "We just need to use the phone." The knocking turned into pounding. Then came the scraping. A slow, high-pitched dragging sound against the glass, like nails sliding down a chalkboard. The air shifted, grew thick, suffocating, and then laughter. Low, amused, hungry. I shoved my hands against my ears. 2:14 a.m. I couldn't take it. The sounds, the voices, the waiting. I squeezed my eyes shut and did the only thing I could. I sank to the floor, curling in on myself, pressing my forehead against my knees. I needed to drown it out. I needed to wait, just 3 more minutes. Then, something changed. The laughter stopped. The knocking stopped. The voices stopped. The diner fell into absolute silence. The kind of silence that feels wrong, like something's missing. Like the world itself has stopped breathing. I lifted my head. The kitchen lights flickered once, then went out. Darkness. 2:15 a.m. And then I heard it. A noise from inside the kitchen. Not from the diner, not from outside. From right here, in the dark, with me. It was quiet. A shift of weight. A soft dragging sound against the tiled floor. It wasn't Gus. Gus was gone. It wasn't me. I wasn't moving. Something else was here. And it was close. I forced myself to stay still. Stay quiet. Don't move. Don't breathe too loud. The noise came again, closer this time. My fingers dug into my arms. My heartbeat pounded in my skull. I couldn't see anything, but I felt it. Something tall, standing just feet away from me. Watching. Waiting. Then, it spoke. But not in a whisper. Not in a voice. In my voice. "Let us in." I squeezed my eyes shut so tight I saw white. 2:16 a.m. I just had to last one more minute. The air in the room felt thicker, pressing against my skin, like invisible fingers curling around my arms, my throat. Then, a shift. I didn't hear it move, but I felt it. It was right in front of me. I could feel its breath against my cheek, cold, wrong, unnatural. Then, a hand brushed my arm. I choked down a scream, biting down so hard on my lip I tasted blood. Don't move. Don't breathe too loud. Then, just as suddenly, it was gone. The pressure lifted, the air thinned like whatever had been in the room with me had simply vanished. I hesitated. I didn't dare breathe. Then, the neon light outside flickered, casting a brief red glow through the crack beneath the door. I barely had time to register it before 2:17 a.m. It was over. I sucked in a shaking breath and forced myself to stand, my legs weak, my body trembling violently. I reached out, fumbling blindly for the light switch, and the moment my fingers found it, I flipped it on. Nothing. The kitchen was normal. No warped walls, no strange shadows, no impossible spaces stretching farther than they should. But Gus was still gone. I needed to get out. I turned to the door, gripping the handle with slick, sweaty fingers, and pushed it open. The diner was empty. The booths were back. The counter was back. The woman in red was gone. But the front door, it was open. Just slightly. A sliver of the outside world bleeding into the diner, the wind howling like something alive. The air inside felt wrong, still, heavy, like something had gotten in. I didn't move. I barely breathed. My fingers were still slick with sweat where they gripped the doorframe. I wanted to believe I was alone, that whatever had been knocking, whatever had whispered my name, had left. But I knew better. Slowly, carefully, I stepped forward. The fluorescent lights above buzzed softly, the hum filling the diner's eerie silence. The booths were empty. The counter was empty. The street outside was deserted, no signs of anyone. But the door, it wasn't just open. Something had touched it. The handle, the frame, it was streaked with something dark, smeared, like handprints dragged across it. The color was wrong. Not just red, darker, deeper. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. I needed to close it. I needed to lock it. My feet felt like lead as I forced myself forward, one slow step at a time, my skin crawling with the overwhelming feeling that I was being watched. I reached the door and raised a trembling hand toward the handle. A sharp creak came from behind me. My entire body locked up. It came from inside the diner, a booth. One of the seats shifting, leather squeaking under weight that hadn't been there a second ago. Something was here. I turned my head. Booth number 6. The seat was occupied. I hadn't heard the door open. I hadn't heard footsteps. 1 second, the booth was empty. The next, it wasn't. The man in the gray suit, he sat perfectly still, hands resting neatly on the table, a thin, polite smile stretched across his face. But his eyes, they weren't right. They weren't human, flat, colorless. The kind of emptiness that made my stomach twist painfully. "You forgot something," he said. His voice didn't match his face. It was wrong, like it came from somewhere else, like someone was speaking through him instead of him speaking himself. I didn't answer. I couldn't. He lifted one hand, slowly, deliberately, and tapped the table with 2 fingers. A quiet, rhythmic sound that somehow made my entire body break into cold sweat. Tap, tap, tap. He wasn't supposed to be here. Not like this. I didn't see him come in. I didn't seat him at booth number 6. And yet, there he was. "Sit," he said, voice smooth, inviting. Expecting. I shook my head, throat too tight to form words. His smile didn't falter, but the air around him shifted. The lights above flickered, shadows stretching impossibly long across the floor. I said, his voice deepened, curling at the edges like something ancient, something starving. "Sit." The door behind me slammed shut on its own. The diner grew darker, the air heavier. I could feel it pressing down on me, pressing into my skull, pushing against my thoughts. I wasn't going to make it out of here. Not unless I did what he wanted. Not unless I sat down. I swallowed hard, my legs shaking as I forced myself to move forward. My body screamed at me to run, but the pressure in the air, the weight of his gaze, kept me locked in place. I slid into the seat across from him. The leather felt ice cold beneath me. The moment I was settled, the lights flickered again, this time longer. A brief instant of complete darkness. When they came back on, the man was smiling. Wider this time. I wished he hadn't been. His teeth were wrong. Too many. Too sharp. I gripped the edge of the table so hard my knuckles turned white. "You should be careful," he said, tilting his head slightly. "Breaking the rules is dangerous." I felt a chill creep up my spine. I didn't. I tried to speak, but my voice cracked, barely more than a whisper. His eyes gleamed. Did you lock the door before 2:13? My stomach dropped. No, I hadn't. I had been too distracted. You left the door open, he continued, grinning now, teeth gleaming in the dim light. You let something in. My pulse pounded in my ears. What got in? I whispered. His grin widened. Would you like to see? Before I could react, he reached out and grabbed my wrist. Pain exploded through my skin like fire, like ice, like something gnawing into my flesh with invisible teeth. I choked on a scream, trying to pull away, but his grip tightened, impossibly strong. The diner shifted, the walls rippled, the floor darkened beneath me, cracks spreading like veins reaching for my feet. The hum of the lights turned into a low, droning whisper, voices curling around my ears, speaking words I couldn't understand. And then, the window. The glass changed. It wasn't reflecting the diner anymore. It was showing something else. Something on the other side. A figure stood there, tall, motionless, no face, just a gaping, black hole where a mouth should be. And then it moved, slowly, deliberately. It raised one hand and pressed it against the glass. My breath caught in my throat. I knew that hand. I knew that shape. It was mine. It was me. But it wasn't. It tilted its head, mimicking my movements perfectly. Then it smiled, a grin splitting impossibly wide, stretching across its empty face, revealing rows of jagged, twisting teeth. The glass shuddered. I could feel something pulling me toward the window. Toward it. The man in the gray suit leaned in, his grip still crushing my wrist. It's been waiting, he whispered, and now it's finally inside. I opened my mouth to scream, and the lights went out. A thick, suffocating darkness swallowed the diner, pressing against my skin like something alive. My breath hitched, my pulse hammering so loud it drowned out everything else. Then, movement, a shift in the air, a whisper of something unseen, sliding through the blackness. I couldn't see him, the man in the gray suit, but I could feel him, still there, still watching, and something else, something closer. I sucked in a sharp breath, forcing my body to stay still. My fingers gripping the edge of the table so tight they ached. The silence stretched, unnatural, wrong. Then a sound, a wet, slithering scrape against the floor. I swallowed down a scream. It was moving toward me. I didn't know what it was. I didn't want to know, but my instincts screamed danger. My lungs burned, my body begging me to run, to move, to do anything except sit here in the blackness, waiting for whatever had slithered into the diner. A breath, not mine, right next to me. Something exhaled, long and slow, its breath thick with decay. I squeezed my eyes shut. I wasn't alone. The lights flickered. For a split second, the diner was illuminated in a sickly yellow glow. And I saw it, bent over me. It had no face, no eyes, just a smooth, gaping void where its features should have been. And it was smiling. The light snapped off again, plunging me back into the dark. I jerked back, a strangled gasp ripping from my throat. The booth's leather was slick with sweat, at my own body trembling as I scrambled to get away, but I couldn't move. Something cold clamped around my wrist. The grip was like iron, crushing, unyielding. The man in the gray suit. You let it in, he whispered. The lights flickered, again just for a second, and the thing was even closer. It was climbing onto the table. A hand, long, twisted fingers tipped with splintered nails reached for me. Then, the lights blasted on. Blinding. The thing was gone. The man in the gray suit was still seated across from me, his expression unchanged, as if nothing had happened. I yanked my wrist free, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I wanted to run. I needed to run. But my legs wouldn't move. He tilted his head. You shouldn't have left the door open. I sucked in a breath, my mind racing, my skin crawling with the lingering sensation of something watching me. What was that? I choked out. His smile remained, thin and wrong. You'll find out soon enough. I didn't wait. I shoved myself out of the booth, my legs buckling beneath me, barely managing to keep myself upright as I staggered back toward the counter. The diner felt different, like something had shifted, like the walls weren't in the same place anymore. I reached the counter, my hands shaking as I gripped the edge for support. I needed to get out. I needed to leave. The man in the gray suit wasn't stopping me. He just sat there, smiling, like he was waiting for something. The clock on the wall ticked, loud, too loud, 2:15 a.m. My stomach dropped. Rule number 2. Between 2:13 and 2:17 a.m., do not look outside. I had 2 minutes left. 2 minutes to keep my eyes down, to not look at the windows, to not acknowledge what was out there. I gritted my teeth, my pulse hammering. The knocking started immediately. A slow, deliberate tap against the glass. I clenched my hands into fists, my nails biting into my palms. The knock came again. Harder, closer, and then the sound of something dragging along the windows. Something with too many fingers. I bit my lip, forcing myself to stay still, to keep my eyes on the counter. But the sound wouldn't stop, scratching, tapping. A voice, low and wrong, murmuring my name. I squeezed my eyes shut. Do not look, do not look. The voice pressed against my skull, slipping into my thoughts like an oily whisper. You already let one of us in. What's the harm in another? My breath hitched. I could feel it, right outside the window, right on the other side of the glass, waiting for me to make a mistake. The lights flickered. The diner groaned, the air thick with something unseen, crawling beneath my skin. A loud, heavy thump hit the glass. I flinched, and my eyes moved. Just for a second, just a glimpse. It was looking at me, from the other side of the glass. My face, my body, my movements. But the smile wasn't mine. It was too wide, too sharp, too hungry. The lights blasted on again. The diner was empty. The knocking had stopped. The windows were clear. The clock on the wall read 2:18 a.m. I gasped, my knees nearly giving out, the cold sweat dripping down my back. I had made it, barely. But something was wrong. I felt different. The air didn't feel the same against my skin, like it wasn't my skin anymore. The man in the gray suit stood up. He adjusted his cuffs, smoothing down the fabric before meeting my gaze one last time. His grin was wider now, like he had seen exactly what happened, and he was pleased. Then, without a word, he walked out of the diner. The door never opened. He was just gone. I stood there, shaking, my breath uneven. I didn't move, didn't dare move, because somewhere in the back of my mind, a voice whispered. Not from outside, not from behind me, from within. And it said, I'm inside now. The words slithered through my skull like something alive, sinking in, settling. I gasped, staggering back, my breath coming in short, ragged bursts. No, that wasn't real. It wasn't. But I felt it. Something else was in my head. Something that wasn't me. I gripped the counter, my fingers digging into the cool surface, my knuckles white. The diner was too quiet now. The hum of the old fluorescent lights, the distant buzz of the street lamp outside, gone, like the world had gone silent. Like something was listening. I swallowed hard. I had to get out. The door opened, a slow, deliberate creak. Cold air slithered in, thick with the scent of wet earth. And then, footsteps. Soft, measured, coming toward me. I forced myself to look up. The woman in the red dress was standing at the counter. Her dress clung to her like wet fabric, the deep crimson soaked darker near the hem. Her hair was long, dripping onto the floor, leaving small black puddles beneath her feet. I couldn't move. I knew the rule. Do not acknowledge her. Do not take her order. She tilted her head, her lips splitting into a wide, unnatural smile. You look tired, she murmured. I clenched my jaw, my heart pounding so hard it felt like my ribs would crack. She leaned in closer. Her breath smelled like rotting flowers and damp soil. What's wrong? She whispered, her tone almost mocking. I turned and ran. I didn't think, I just moved. I threw myself into the back room, slamming the door shut behind me, my breath heaving in my chest. The moment the door clicked, the diner fell silent again. No footsteps, no voice, nothing. I backed up, my hands shaking, my mind racing. I needed to stay here. I needed to wait until she left. That's what the rule said. But something was wrong. The room, it wasn't the back room anymore. The shelves, the old clock, the flickering light above the sink, gone. The air was thicker now, the ceiling lower. The walls looked wet. I turned, my pulse spiking, and stopped. A mirror hung on the far wall, but it wasn't reflecting me. It showed the diner, the counter, the booths, and sitting at booth number 6, me. My stomach twisted. I was looking at myself, but the other me wasn't moving. They were just sitting there, hands flat against the table, staring straight ahead. I felt something cold slither down my spine. The other me, they weren't breathing. They weren't blinking. They were waiting. I took a step back, my pulse hammering. No, this wasn't real. This couldn't be real. Then the other me turned their head. I froze. Their lips curled into a slow, deliberate smile. And then they spoke. You should sit down, they whispered. Their voice, it was mine, but it sounded wrong, like it had been hollowed out, emptied. The diner around them shifted. The booths lengthened, stretching into the dark. The counter curled, twisting like something alive. I shook my head, panic rising fast in my chest. No, I'm here. That's not me. That's not me. The other me tilted their head, the smile never fading. Then, a knock at the door. Slow, rhythmic. 2:13 a.m. The knocking grew louder, heavier. Something wanted in. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to think, trying to breathe. Another knock. And then, a voice. Low, familiar. Let me in. My own voice. I gasped, stumbling back. No, 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 no. The knocking became pounding. The door rattled on its hinges. I backed up against the mirror, my breath ragged, my body trembling. I couldn't let it in. I wouldn't. But something was already here. A whisper slithered through the room, curling around me like a hand at my throat. You let one of us in already. I choked on my breath. The door burst open, and I saw myself, standing in the doorway, dripping wet, smiling. But their eyes were empty. Black pits stretching too far, too deep, pulling the air out of my lungs. I told you, they whispered. Then they stepped forward, and the lights went out. Everything collapsed. The walls, the floor, the ceiling. The diner was gone, and I was falling. Through darkness, through silence, through something alive. The air was thick with whispers, voices curling around me, pressing into my skin, my skull, my thoughts. I tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed. And then I landed. Hard. The cold linoleum pressed against my cheek, the distant hum of the diner lights buzzing above me. I gasped, shoving myself up. My breath ragged. I was back. The diner looked normal, like nothing had happened, but something had. Something had changed. I turned toward the counter and stopped. Booth number 6 was occupied, and I was sitting there, not moving, not breathing, waiting. I couldn't breathe. My entire body was frozen, every nerve in my system screaming at me to run, to move, to do something. But I was locked in place, staring at myself across the diner like a deer caught in the headlights of something that wasn't a car, but something hungry. This isn't real. It can't be real. I forced myself to step forward, my legs feeling like they weren't mine. My shoes squeaked against the linoleum floor, and the sound was deafening in the suffocating silence of the diner. The figure in booth number 6 smiled. My stomach lurched. It was my face, but wrong. The expression stretched too wide, too knowing, like it was in on a secret I would never understand. I opened my mouth to speak, to demand, to beg, to do anything. But the moment I did, the diner changed. The lights flickered. The air thickened, pressing in on my chest like unseen hands. The neon sign outside sputtered, casting erratic, broken flashes of red and white through the window. And then, the door creaked open. A wave of cold air slithered through, carrying with it a scent that made my stomach churn. Something damp, something rotting. The diner's silence shattered. Footsteps. Deliberate, measured. Someone was coming in. I turned, heart hammering against my ribs. The man in the gray suit. Rule number 1. His face was obscured by the shadow of his fedora, but I could feel his eyes locked onto me. He walked with an unnatural fluidity, like something imitating the idea of movement rather than moving itself. He stopped just inside the door. I tried to speak, tried to tell him booth 6 is taken, you have to leave, but my voice caught in my throat. He didn't look at the thing sitting in my booth. He looked at me. And then he smiled. The lights went out. I couldn't see, couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Then whispers, slithering through the dark, low, countless, surrounding me. They weren't speaking in words, not exactly, but I understood. Something was here. Something had been waiting. And now, it was time. The diner shifted around me, stretching, pulling, becoming something else. The counter warped, the tiles beneath my feet pulsed, and the walls shrank inward like something breathing. And then, a hand wrapped around my wrist. I screamed, yanking away, stumbling back. The lights flickered once, and everything snapped back to normal. The diner was still. The booths, the counter, the neon lights outside, like nothing had happened, except booth number 6 was empty. The man in the gray suit was gone, and so was the other me. My breath hitched, my hands shaking so hard I had to clench them into fists just to feel real. And then, a sharp knock at the window. 2:16 a.m. No, no. I squeezed my eyes shut, the rules screaming inside my head, do not look outside, no matter what you hear. But the knocking, it was louder now, urgent, desperate. Something was out there. Something that wanted me to look. The knocking turned into pounding. The walls trembled. The air grew thick, buzzing, electric. Then the whispers came back. Right behind me. Low. Hungry. Something breathed against my ear. My name. Not a whisper. Rule number 5. I turned and ran, straight to the kitchen. My fingers fumbled for the light switch, plunging the room into darkness. I dropped to the floor, curling into myself, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I counted. 1. The whispers grew louder. 2. Footsteps slow, near the door. 3. Something else was breathing now. 4. 5. 6. The air shuddered. 7. 8. The footsteps moved closer. 9. 10. They stopped, right outside the kitchen door. My lungs burned. I bit down on my lip hard enough to taste blood. 15. The door handle rattled. 18. 19. The whispers slithered inside the room. 22. The footsteps moved again. But this time, they were coming toward me. I clenched my eyes shut. Don't move. Don't breathe. 28. The footsteps stopped, right beside me. 29. The darkness breathed. A voice, low, rasping, too close. Time's up. 30. Everything collapsed. The walls folded. The air disappeared. And suddenly, I was standing behind the counter again. The diner was quiet. The neon sign buzzed outside, and the clock, 2:18 a.m. It was over. I was alive. I exhaled, shaking, my entire body numb. And then, the door opened. A man stepped inside. Gray suit. He removed his hat, smiled. "Booth number 6, please." I turned to look, and the booth was empty. I stepped forward, heart hammering, and then I saw it. My own reflection in the diner window, smiling, even though I wasn't.